Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. On this week's episode, we're going deep on the current state of editorial newsletters. I think it's safe to say at this point that digital publishers recognize the importance of email newsletters. In 2016, Facebook pulled the rug out from underneath a media industry that had, until then, relied on it for hockey stick growth. And over the next several years, publishers generally warmed to the idea that the decentralized distribution offered by email newsletters would prove more reliable than the fickle whims of social media giants. Today, nearly every media company has a robust email marketing strategy, and some news startups interact with their readerships almost entirely within the inbox. We've also seen the launch of platforms that make it easier for individual writers to distribute their own newsletters and monetize them through paid subscriptions. So are newsletters reaching a saturation point? Are they generating real ad revenue? And can newsletters actually replace Facebook as a referral source? These are just some of the questions I put toward Ernie Smith, the creator and editor of Tedium, a fantastic newsletter that almost operates as a kind of Wikipedia of obscure topics. Smith also runs a popular Facebook group for the newsletter industry, and he's one of the most knowledgeable people I know when it comes to newsletter trends. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about my email newsletter. If you're not subscribed, then you're missing out on some of the most in-depth analysis on the media industry that you'll find anywhere. This week, for instance, I just published a 1,500-word article about why Complex Media is one of the most innovative digital publishers, and I'm about to produce a long deep dive into how Business Insider runs its paid subscription business. But don't just take my word for it. Here's magazine publisher Phil O'Brien talking about why he enjoys my newsletter.
I like the fact that you've got a journalistic background, and that adds an integrity to it. But I do feel that there's a real proper viewpoint, and it's very considered, and you've researched the subject. So it really helps me. You're super helpful, keeping me in touch with various aspects of the media industry that I'd miss or not have the time for otherwise.
Who do you think is kind of like the ideal reader for my newsletter?
I think it is somebody who is in media and is curious. You're looking at that. You're definitely looking for people who are entrepreneurial. And I think it's probably for a lot of journalists who are struggling in a new environment, who are trying to get briefed as to, what do I do now? My local newspaper is closed down, my local outlet, I've got, what can I do? And what's nice is you give a realistic approach.
Again, if you want to subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Okay, let's jump into my interview with Ernie Smith. Hey, Ernie, thanks for joining us.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, thanks for coming on again. I brought you on because you're one of the foremost experts on editorial newsletters. Tell us about the newsletter you write and edit now, Tedium.
I just celebrated my 5th anniversary of doing Tedium. It's a newsletter that looks for, as I call it, the dull side of the internet. And basically what that entails is basically looking for obscurities, old tech, things that have been buried on the current internet that take a while to find. And I write long, I try to be clever, and occasionally it works out for me.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as like a Wikipedia of obscurity, like that you go really deep on subjects that there might be a Wikipedia page on them, there might not be, but they're not going to go as deep on that particular subject, on that obscure subject as you do.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I know that there's one example, like there was a used video game store called Funkoland that was a really big chain for a while, but if you look at Wikipedia for that, they were bought out by GameStop like 20 years ago, and they're barely even mentioned. So, instead of going to Wikipedia, you can just read Tedium to get that information.
And so it must do really well from a search engine point of view, because there's got to be, collectively, after 5 years of doing this, you've written on a lot of subjects that a lot of people are searching on the internet for. And because you're kind of going really deep on subjects that nobody else has gone deep on, Tedium probably does really well for those particular search terms.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that some of the ones that tend to do really well for us are ones about weird phone numbers, which I've written about a couple of times, and how people cut their fingernails before the Industrial Revolution. That one did pretty well as well.
And so you've been really successful in the sense of like you've been your newsletter's been featured on the popular podcast Planet Money. You've been featured on all kinds of publications like Vice multiple times. How successful has TDM been from an audience growth perspective?
I would say that it's had its moments. Like I would say that it comes in fits and starts. I'm not trying to like actively like market it out like every 5 minutes. I want it to be kind of more of a word of mouth thing, which I think has actually been good for it because it's not like I'm one guy. I have a couple of writers that occasionally contribute, but at the same time, it's like it's a natural level of growth for me. So I kind of like that about the approach that I take.
And I think last time you came on, you were somewhere north of 10,000 subscribers. Has it grown substantially since then?
Not particularly, but that's okay. I honestly don't think that it's not. I honestly don't think that subscriber growth is like the end all be all in this. Is in part because you want 10,000 good subscribers rather than 50,000 subscribers. Most of who just like put it in the spam folder anyway.
Yeah. And I encourage listeners to go back and listen to our original conversation where we really go deep on Tedium and also your previous iteration as kind of like a Tumblr celebrity, so to speak. So definitely go back. But this discussion, I kind of brought you on to talk about, the state of editorial newsletters in the industry at large. You also run a Facebook group for newsletter professionals, right?
Yeah, I've been running them since 2017, in part because it didn't seem like there was anything of that nature, especially for editorial creators. And I thought that it was a good opportunity to kind of bring everybody together. And it's been running for about 2.5 years now, and it seems to be something that a lot of folks are really into.
And anecdotally, and then so I belong to this group. Lots of people are kind of chiming in with their tips and tricks or asking, questions about certain newsletter providers and stuff like that. Has it seemed to kind of balloon as the publishing industry at large has become more and more interested in newsletters?
Yeah, I would say that it's pretty close to 1,000 members right now. It tends to draw in people largely on the strength of, my boss told me about this group, so I decided to join. That usually tends to be the type of signups we get, which I think is a good sign because it shows that like that kind of community is needed for the editorial world.
So, in terms of like why it's needed, like as we head into 2020, would you say that nearly every publisher has embraced the idea that newsletters play a vital role in their editorial strategy?
I think so. I think that it's one of those things that in many ways it's much more stable than some of the social media alternatives, so to say, in part because you really control the list. Like you're the one in charge of managing when it goes out. Like there aren't as many variables in terms of it's not like Gmail is going to randomly stop showing your newsletter one day, whereas Facebook, like the algorithm has proven to take organic reach and just kind of throw it down the toilet after a little while. So I think that in large part because of that changing nature of social media, people are kind of going back a little bit to the newsletter as something that's a little bit more consistent and a little bit more organic and authentic.
Yeah, like I remember working at a major national magazine back in like 2012 or so, and this was just right at the height of kind of Facebook turning on the traffic spigot and just sending boatloads of traffic via pages and organic shares, and also just giving lots of free followers. Like we were all of a sudden put on all these recommended user lists on Facebook and saw our Facebook following just jump over to like 1 million. It was like 3,000 when I started there, And, not long after I left, we had over 1 million followers. And a lot of that was just Facebook giving us free followers. And I just remember trying to I kind of got the inkling that like some publishers were starting to learn that newsletters were actually sending like really valuable traffic. And this was, around the time that Alexis Magical had written his article about dark social and how a lot of this direct traffic that we were seeing in our analytics wasn't actually direct. It was coming from email. And I was starting to get that inkling, but I could just not get the editors interested at all at launching a newsletter. And I did not succeed by the time I left that magazine. So it shows really how far we've come. So how much is the rise of newsletters a direct result of publishers distancing themselves from large centralized social media platforms like Facebook?
I definitely think that with email newsletters, it's something that has definitely grown over the last few years. I think it's definitely response to social media. It's become something that has been much more prominent in the last year or two, just because of that. I think that also if you take a look at what is happening with email, like just that space, it seems like that there's definitely response like from the vendors like that provide email software. Like it's becoming increasingly more sophisticated and complex as time goes on. And I think that very much of that ties into the fact that, not just publishers, like e-commerce, like vendors and stuff are coming back to email as a platform to really like consistently own.
And just to kind of illustrate like the difference, like, with Facebook, you look at some of the metrics and they're showing to well less than like sometimes like as low as like 5% or lower per post to your actual audience. Like you can actually see this in the Facebook Insights. Whereas for email, not only are you seeing like almost 100% actual, like 100% of your subscribers are at least seeing the subject line in their inbox, but some of the more successful newsletter writers or newsletter publishers are seeing open rates as high as like 50%. So just like the amount of opportunity there for publishers, they've noticed that disparity and how much of a more direct link they have with their audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, if you can pull off the consistency angle of it, like if that like you can get an email in people's inbox at like just to offer an example, I think Morning Brew, they usually are in my inbox right around 6:00 in the morning every weekday. Like if you can pull off that kind of consistency and like have a certain voice and tone in your subject lines, I think that you can have a lot of success like getting people to consistently open it. And it's something that I don't think you can control, especially not like, on a truly organic level with like a Facebook post.
Yeah. But do you ever worry about like Gmail, like now that it has over 1 billion users, like having too much centralized power to the point where it could really start pulling a Facebook and choking off distribution?
It's weird because I was thinking about this just the other day, not necessarily with Gmail particularly. I was kind of worried a little bit more about MailChimp because I learned that, they released some of their stats and they said like they had something like 60% of the email marketing software market, which is just crazy to me considering there are so many vendors. But yeah. I think that in terms of Gmail, that's always been kind of a lingering concern. I think that, if you look, they do have like the sponsored items like in the top of the promoted sections, which might pull away people. But at the same time, I think that in many ways, if they were going to do that, why would they wait until now? Why not 5 years ago?
Yeah. Although they've played around with, priority inbox, important inbox, and then the, various social and promotion tabs and stuff like that. You could tell that Google is unsatisfied with how email has developed organically, and they're trying to reinvent what email can be in terms of, allowing like basically people to host almost entire websites within, actual their actual emails if they're sent via Gmail, stuff like that. So I could see them like radically introducing new things over time, and because they have so many users, that could definitely alter how a sizable portion of your audience, if you're a newsletter creator, like how they consume your newsletters. But I mean, like you said, like they haven't really abused that power yet, so that might mean that they're not planning on doing it in the future. You talk about like how diverse the kind of the provider outlook is in terms of all the different competitors in terms of newsletter distribution. There's this one specific subcategory that I want to focus on, and that's like these kind of free platforms. Like it started really with TinyLetter, and now you're seeing it with like Substack, and then there was this other company called Review, although I think they've pivoted a little bit. Do you think that let's talk about what those are, and do you think that they represent a democratization of newsletters?
I would definitely want to say that is a really good trend. I think that it's something that has really picked up in the last couple of years. I mean, TinyLetter has been around for more than 5 years. It's been owned by MailChimp for quite a while. That seemed to be like a big thing about 2016, 2017 or so. And then MailChimp they didn't give it as much love as they should have, really. Like, it's still there. It's still sending lots of newsletters, but it's become, it's kind of...
It's like a ghost ship. It's like a very skeleton crew. You can tell they're not trying to do anything innovative with it
Yeah,
anymore.
I think that's definitely where I was going with that. And I think that Substack has really picked up that, helm. I think that what they've been doing, just as a little bit of explanation, they're a service that basically makes it so that you can easily monetize and build an email newsletter for editorial. Like, it's specifically built for like writers and editorials, and it's become big enough that even the campaign for Bernie Sanders, I believe that they have a Substack.
Yeah. And it's kind of like the new kind of hot startup, like what Medium was kind of a few years ago in terms of, working in the publishing space and trying to find a way for independent writers to monetize their content. And they have an interesting approach in the sense of they only get paid when you're successful. So like under like a MailChimp, where you kind of get penalized the more subscribers you get because it costs more, they only take a cut of the money that you're making. So for one, like if you're someone like me who doesn't even have a paid version of Substack, like 100% of my Substack emails are free, I don't have to pay anything. And presumably as many subscribers as I get, I won't ever have to pay. And once I turn if I turn the pay part on and I start distributing paid newsletters, then they're only taking 10% of what I make, which is a very interesting model. And it's making, and I guess this is what my main question to you is it opening up newsletters to the masses where, a writer 5 years ago might have been intimidated by a MailChimp or didn't want to have to pay $50 a month. Do you think that this is getting more and more writers onto email newsletters?
I very much think that that's the case. I mean, I'll go back a little bit and just talk about what the experience was when I started my newsletter in 2015, because I knew the TinyLetter was around then. I didn't want to use it because I had like more design ambitions, but I remember like when I started, I was using MailChimp, and to put out my newsletter every issue, it was like finish writing and then spend like 2 hours trying to rebuild the whole thing in MailChimp. And I think I wanted to pull out my hair at the end of it. I mean, it just like, it's so clearly built for marketing versus editorial. So, I mean, I think that from that perspective, it's like, it has a high cost, there's an Inc. article that was talking about this a couple of years ago, where it's like your subscriber list on MailChimp is like the most expensive type of cloud storage on the entire internet, because like it's only just a list of names, and they like charge you up the nose for it.
Yeah, regardless of how often you're
Yeah,
sending a newsletter, like it's entirely based on not use, but just the list of names that you happen to have uploaded to the
yeah,
server.
exactly. And then I think that the other aspect of that is that by kind of removing that variable of like of like cost versus what, yeah, versus how often you send and such, like Substack has really kind of flipped it on its head. Like it's made it quite simple. And I mean, while it's a platform like Medium is, I think that there's a bit of ownership that comes with it. Like if you want to like quit Substack, you're just like, man, I'm sick of this thing. Like you can take your list with you, you can take your data with you, like without a problem. And that's something that I think is I think is a real benefit of email versus social media. But I also think as well, like Substack's interface is quite simple. It's something that anybody can really get into, and I think that not just Substack. I think that there are other email providers that are kind of on this trend where there's such a focus on simplicity over trying to like pull out every bell and whistle that they possibly can, and that I think is sort of revolutionary in terms of email marketing.
Well, let's talk about that because like you're kind of like a newsletter power user. Like your newsletter is very well designed. It's very customized to your particular taste. A lot of these free services they kind of take out a lot of that functionality. Like if I'm on Substack, I can't create segmented list. I can't A/B test subject lines. I can't create like a drip campaign. All these things that you can do on a more robust platform like Mailchimp. Do you think? I mean, do you think that's fine? Like that it is like this. Some of these fastest growing newsletter distributors doesn't allow that. Do you think that was only being used by power users anyway? So they have their option with Mailchimp, but for everybody else, like what these Substacks of the world, what they're offering is good enough. Like, what is your view on the fact that these are actually much more simplistic
I mean,
platforms?
personally, I would love to see more design in emails. Like that's, just speaking from my point of view as somebody who creates email and like kind of thinks about it as sort of a visual platform. I think that in many ways it's kind of tough to it's kind of tough to do all that because email by and large, I wrote a piece about it last year where I basically said it's one of the only mediums, in web design where they still use tables for everything, and it's really kind of a dark art almost. And I think as a result, like that adds a lot of complexity to it, and to me that makes it make a lot of sense that they took all that stuff out. I mean, most people aren't crazy like me and will spend like months trying to figure out like the weird dark arts of like trying to make sure that an email looks okay in Outlook 2003. It's something that I think the average writer just would not want to deal with. Like it gets in the way of their creation, it gets in the way of their content. And I think that if you don't have like somebody paid just to handle all that stuff, it almost feels like why bother.
How viable is the newsletter ad market? Because like you have a few startups now, like Morning Brew, The Hustle, of like Axios that are really kind of doubling down and creating, at least on surface level, profitable businesses based on newsletter advertising. But I get the sense that it's not really like a scalable market. It's still dependent on kind of very native, customized ads and a strong sales team. Like how viable is the newsletter ad market?
I think that it's very much, I think that while there is definitely, some programmatic stuff out there, like, I know that there's this company called Paved that is running a service like that. Um, I think by and large, it tends to be more like you're buying on the issue or you're buying, a certain number of readers will open this email up and you're basically paying by that rate, but it's not like, it's not like the web ad market where it tends to be much more sophisticated and that sort of thing. I mean, like with my site, and my newsletter, I tend to, I tend to like do advertising that has more of a hand crafted native type of approach. And I think that like a lot of newsletters, if they're dipping into that well, like it tends to be that sort of thing where like rather than trying to like, put in like a banner ad, like they will, like they'll just mention the sponsor at the bottom of the message or at the top of the message, or try to make it so that it's a differentiator in terms of how it's promoted. Like they may not do like programmatic ads, but it can be, it can be sort of its own thing as a result of that.
So if you wanted to make a newsletter publisher that is, advertising focused, there's no marketplace you can kind of plug into. Like you're going to have to basically hire an ad sales team that's going to have to do that kind of heavy lift of developing those direct relationships with sponsors, is what you're saying.
I think to a degree, yes. I mean, I definitely think that, with my own experiences, like often, people will come to me, like they may find they may find Tedium on a list of, newsletters that you can sponsor, or, they just kind of know the name, like, oh, this guy's been running a newsletter for how many ever years. And, he does it twice a week and he does advertising. So, like often I'm not like, I know in my case, I'm not necessarily like, putting an ad team out there being like, hey, come sponsor my newsletter. But I think that if you're like kind of doing this at a higher, more serious level than possibly I am, you're definitely going to want a more traditional ad team for this. And it's something that, again, going back to, Substack and that whole thing, like they don't even have to worry about ads because they're just having people pay for it. It's almost like the market has kind of filtered itself a little bit, where you have the really big newsletters that are doing advertising, and then you have like the smaller, more niche ones that are just like, if you pay $5-10 a month, I will send you this newsletter, and it'll be on this really niche topic that like I don't expect like 50,000 people to want to read, but for the 3,000 people that do, here it is.
Yeah. So like if you are wanting to start kind of like a small newsletter publishing operation in 2020, would your recommendation then be, since you don't have enough money to hire an ad sales staff, the better way to go is just to try to go with the straight the subscription model, like the paid subscriptions?
Yeah, either that or like do a Patreon or something like that. I think that Patreon is a fine option. It's not as hard of a paywall as like something like Substack, where you do like a paid, where you do paid issues. But I think at the same time, it's definitely, I think that it's definitely that kind of mindset where, while there are ad networks out there, like I don't think that they're as targeted towards like the person who, like had a wacky idea for a newsletter and it turned out to be like something that seems like it might be a bit of a hit,
Yeah. Yeah. I tried to do Patreon. Like I tried to go like my own paid subscription route a few years ago. And unfortunately it was before Substack had launched. I could have really used a platform like that. I felt like Patreon was as a writer, was a very difficult platform to get subscribers on. Unless you were distributing 100, like I was distributing on my own articles on my own website and Tiny Letter and Medium, and kind of cobbling those together. Patreon does have kind of like some newsletter functionality, but it isn't like its first and foremost kind of feature. And I felt like it's better for podcasters and YouTubers, whereas Substack is more newsletter oriented. I don't know. So I like Substack because it's like such a self-contained ecosystem where you're both publishing your free content and your paid content on it. So I think there's a little bit more synergy that's happening there. I don't know if you've seen a lot of successful writers on Patreon. I've mostly only encountered like YouTubers and podcasters and some musicians.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, like I will say that I do have a Patreon, and it's while it's not like covering everything to the point where I can quit my day job. It's enough that like it allows me to pay for to have like contributing writers. So like I'm not just like asking people to write for free. Like it actually it actually is substantial enough that it kind of covers a little bit for me, but it's not like I'm you know I'm like living off of it.
Yeah, yeah. So so now that we're entering this era when every publisher, it seems like they're launching newsletters, and not just newsletters that link out to their articles on the web, but kind of like standalone newsletters that are self-contained. Do you think that like we're approaching any kind of newsletter fatigue? Like I feel like I'm reaching this point where I have to be extremely choosy if I subscribe to another newsletter because I'm maxing out on the available time I have to spend on them. Do you think we're going to start seeing some diminishing returns?
I definitely think that it's a situation where it's more generalized. It's not just newsletters. I think that what's happening more in general is that because there are so many creative outlets now, that people are going to get flooded no matter what. And I think that you can kind of see this both in terms of the amount of content that's out there. Like, there are so many YouTube videos like being made by independent creators that you can watch on a daily basis. So many podcasts, so many newsletters. Like there's just so much stuff out there, and as a result, like it's a lot to take in. But I also think on a financial standpoint, like if you're supporting like 20 people on Patreon and subscribe to like 3 Substacks, I mean, like that's like a phone bill for some people. It's a lot of money, and it kind of builds up. And I think that what ends up happening is that at some point people are going to decide like, well, this seems really interesting, but is it really worth like $5-10 a month for me? And that I think is what we're going to see. I think there's going to be a degree of churn, and it's going to be a more generalized fatigue that hits. It's not going to be just newsletters. It's not going to be just podcasts. I think it's going to be more of a situation where people who create have finally found this model, and the problem is the model works so well that everybody's using it.
Yeah. Although, like, if let's say, like, the max number is like 5 subscriptions for everybody, like, and let's say there's like 100 million adults times in the US who can afford 5 subscriptions, then that's like 500 million subscriptions that are up in the air, and that can be divided a lot of different ways. And when you only need like 1,000 people, I don't know. I just feel like that those numbers can be sliced and diced a lot of different ways, and it's not as dire as people say, where all of a sudden fatigue will kick in, and then all new subscriptions will just stop. Whereas I feel like it's kind of like anything, like nobody ever worried about CD fatigue with musicians because they realized there was going to be some very successful musicians, and there's going to be some mid-list musicians that made decent livings, and then some where they were just kind of side livings and kind of subsidizes what they were doing. Same thing with books. Like there are millions of books published every year, but nobody worries about book fatigue. You get what I'm kind of saying? Like there will be there will continue to be some very successful operations. There will be some middling operations, and then some that just don't succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see that, and I think that that's a fair point. I do kind of wonder though, like if we see a recession in the next 2 or 3 years, like what impact is that going to have on this budding economy of creativity where people are willing to pay like their favorite creators directly? I mean, it's a up in the air kind of question right now, but I think that it's something that creators are probably going to feel more directly than they might have in the past, where it might have been their employer that was kind of dealing with all that stuff rather than, somebody who's like living off of Patreon.
Yeah, for sure. Although, like, I don't know. I guess we'll see what that recession will do. Like, one, we're kind of jaded because we lived through one of the greatest recessions in the last 100 years. Like a lot of the other recessions are somewhat mild. And like one statistic I like to go back with like the Great Recession is like if you had a college degree, the unemployment rate for those with college degrees only went up to like something like 4%, even though we were having 10% unemployment overall. So there's going to like the people who are most likely to subscribe to newsletters, I'm sure they'll still have plenty of money as long as it's not like a super deep recession. So I don't know. It's hard to figure out what kind of impact that would have over the publishing industry.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, it's something to keep an eye on. I mean, I'm just kind of, I'm trying to be realistic. If the sky falls, like, I want to be the first to know that the sky's about to fall.
You want to carve out your little niche so that you're safe.
Exactly. I want my own, fallout shelter.
Yeah. So what are some examples of newsletters where you think the publisher is doing something cool and interesting? Like, what are some of the favorite things that you like reading on a regular basis?
I mean, I definitely think that, I tend to be like, I tend to be very much of an industry kind of nerd in terms of like the things that I read. Like, what I mean that is like, because I'm a journalist, I read journalistic things. I think that, I think that in terms of more general things, I really love what Morning Brew does. I think that it's a really well put together newsletter, and I think that it's, it has like a specific flavor and tone to it that is really, it's hard to pull that off like on a daily basis, and I think that they do a really good job with that. I think that I think that in terms of things that I read that are more industry related, the American Press Institute has a daily newsletter that they do, which I find to be a really useful resource, in that like it has a style to it where it kind of makes you think a little bit harder about what's already in the news, and like kind of gives you like that sort of second angle that you may not have thought of, which I think is a really good framing element for a newsletter. I think that I think that definitely there's a lot to pull in. I think that in terms of what is out there, it seems like there's always a lot of like new things that are just kind of floating out there, and some of them will sink, some of them will swim. It's weird because I actually did an interview recently with the guy who has been doing a newsletter for a quarter century, and like not just like a quarter century like here and there, like weekly for a quarter century, and that is like really inspiring to me. Yeah, his name's Randy Casningham, and the newsletter is called This Is True, and he started it before like most people were even using the web, let alone like let alone like having like Gmail or anything like that. And he's kind of kept at it, and it's it's been something that he's done quite a good job at like turning into a business that has managed to sustain him and his family for most of his adult life. That I think is pretty cool.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, Ernie, well, those were all the questions I had. Where can people find you online?
tdm.co is where my newsletter lives. I'm also very active on Twitter. You can find me at the handle shortform Ernie, that's SHORTFORMERNIE. And other than that, I'm sure that my opinions will float up somewhere. I usually can be found on Vice. Like I contribute there quite a bit.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.